Thank you so much, David, Iwa, our hosts, and the staff who've made this evening possible. Not just David for that wonderful introduction, but for the opportunity to be together and celebrate the 50th anniversary of this event on a year that I think is also 120 years since Professor Handler's birth and 25 years since his passing. Later on, I'm going to have the opportunity to introduce our panel of 4 distinguished guests who are joining us. But first, I have the very happy duty of introducing our featured speaker tonight. That puts me in the rather tricky spot of giving an introduction to a man who needs no introduction at all. I feel a little bit like I'm introducing Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock. But I'll say a couple of things very briefly. I looked back at the long and distinguished list of folks who've given the Handler Lecture since its inception. It is an extraordinary, long and distinguished list. Don Turner, Bob Pitofsky, Judge Forrest, Eleanor Fox, Phil Arita gave this lecture 4 times. Last year, Jonathan Cantor. That is a remarkable level of antitrust star power. And what all those folks have in common is that they have helped to shape what antitrust is, how we think and talk about it, and how we imagine what it might become. And if anyone has earned a place on that list in the last decade or so, it is our featured speaker tonight. As you may know, or you may be surprised to know, antitrust is actually not his first intellectual home. He started out in telecommunications, where he coined the term and concept of net neutrality, in the process rather unfairly inflating expectations for pre-tenure legal academics. Then he turned to IP and copyright in particular, and only third came to antitrust. He's written on everything from nascent competition to platform dynamics, and over the last several years, he's helped to forge and lead a movement to challenge and rethink some of the foundations of the way that we do and think about antitrust. He helped to create the Utah Statement in 2019 as a set of principles associated with what's sometimes called the anti-monopoly revival or the neo-Brandeisian movement. In his book, The Curse of Bigness, he put a short, readable, provocative antitrust brief into the hands and homes of people across the country and around the world who might never have found themselves thinking about antitrust before. And then most recently, he served for almost 2 years in a pretty unusual role in the White House as a kind of national coordinator for competition policy. And in that role, he took the helm very famously on the president's executive order on competition policy. So as we stand here today, in the middle of this extraordinarily rich antitrust moment, this epicenter of an antitrust conversation that is more diverse, more vibrant, more open to new views and perspectives than it's been for a very long time, that fact, the richness of that conversation, is, I think, in very large measure due to the work of tonight's featured speaker. And on any view, and by any measure, I think that's a remarkable contribution to our shared political life and to the richness of the antitrust enterprise that we celebrate tonight in Professor Handler's memory. Please join me in welcoming tonight's Handler lecturer, Professor Tim Wu.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. I want to also thank the organizers, particularly Yuan Chin and the co-chairs, for inviting me. It is an honor in particular, and one of the reasons I was excited to give this talk is to give a talk and that is related to Milton Handler, who has always fascinated me as one of the figures who balanced a career in both academia and government, something that I've also aspired to do. He also happened to be an antitrust professor and address antitrust issues in government, so I feel particularly honored to give this lecture. The subject of my talk is the antitrust policy of the Biden administration. Describing the antitrust work of an administration can be hard, especially midstream. It can be tempting in the moment to just focus on high-profile merger challenges or big cases. Conversely, it's easy on the other side in government to make the mistake of thinking that everybody spends their life waiting to hear what you're going to say and pays attention to every little fact sheet that you put out when you're in government. So what I'm trying to do tonight is to put the Biden administration's approach and what it's done so far in historic context. I will admit I am hardly an objective observer, but I will say that this is an administration that has, as the idiom goes, sought to turn the battleship and sought to revive and change antitrust in our times. What we sought to do was to reverse what we felt was a 40-year trend away from the statutory goals of the antitrust and its original intent. And, as the President said several times, an effort to restore a great American tradition. That has meant substantive changes. It has also meant institutional changes. But I think, most critically, what might be best termed a change in categorization. If I were to try to summarize the Biden administration's approach in one sentence, it would be this: we sought to treat antitrust policy as part of the nation's economic policy. Stated otherwise, we thought antitrust policy was economic policy. That may seem self-evident, may be obvious, but in fact there is much that follows from that insight. The insight matters because economic policy is public policy. It's an appropriate matter for democratic input and public concern. The competitiveness of industries, the power of certain companies, the sense of hopelessness before a company or an industry far more powerful than you, opportunities, employment, all of these are issues that are impacted by antitrust and competition policy, and all of these greatly impact people's lives. People on the street may not have strong views about Section 3 of the Clayton Act, although sometimes you'd be surprised. But they do care about things like wages, prices, the sense of opportunity, regional disparities, and the power that companies may have over you. I mentioned earlier FDR, I meant to mention FDR with respect to Milton Handler and his role. And I wanted to say, I don't think it's any secret, that FDR was the great inspiration for the Biden administration's antitrust policy, and in some ways a role model. When I was in the White House, we paid particular attention to a speech that FDR gave in 1937, which was a famous speech about the importance of revitalizing antitrust in that time. I'm not sure if Milton Handler played some role in developing it or editing it, but I will tell you it centered on two truths. Here's what FDR said. The first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. The second truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if its business system does not provide employment and produce and distribute goods in such a way as to sustain an acceptable standard of living. No people, least of all a people with our traditions of personal liberty, will endure a slow erosion of opportunity for the common man, the oppressive sense of helplessness under the domination of a few, which are overshadowing our whole economic life. What I think is the most significant point in this speech is its recognition of the public stakes inherent in the kind of question that antitrust and competition policy deals with, namely, as I've said, the relative competitiveness of major industry and the economic power thereby created. In that speech, FDR would call for a reinvigoration of antitrust, a promise he would follow up by appointing very strong pro-enforcement officials at the Justice Department in particular, and also, in the same speech, a broader approach to economic power that transcended law enforcement and transcended the enforcement agency. and that served as an important guide for us in the Biden administration. If FDR's approach was the inspiration, let me talk through some of the big changes and some of the details. From the earliest days, the administration made it clear, as with FDR presidency, that both the President and the White House were going to play a role in directing and coordinating antitrust policy at the federal level. Now, we were not going to go to the extent of actually dictating who to sue, what kind of litigation to undertake, but we were also not going to go to the extreme distance of just appointing whoever seemed next in line for the DOJ and FTC and calling it a day. You can see these ideas in the President's first major antitrust speech, which took place on July 9th of 2021, when he was signing the executive order on competition. In that speech, the President was careful to set out antitrust and competition policy as a pillar of the administration's economic policy. He also credited both Roosevelts, Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, with creating, and I'm quoting, the American tradition, an antitrust tradition. It's how we ensure, the President said, that our economy isn't about people working for capitalism, it's about capitalism working for people. In that speech, the President made it clear that he wanted his administration to turn the corner. Now, to be fully intellectually honest, it is true that the later parts of the Obama administration had started down this line, and it was also true that during the administration before us that there were a new vibrancy in certain enforcement actions. But we wanted to take this, make it clear, and make it unequivocal that we were turning the corner. Here's what the President said. We've been following the misguided philosophy of people like Robert Bork, and we've been pulling back on enforcing laws to promote competition. We're now 40 years into the experiment of letting giant corporations accumulate more and more power. And what have we gotten from it? Less growth, weakened investment, fewer small businesses. Too many Americans who feel left behind. Too many people who are poorer than their parents. In pursuit of the agenda, which was set out in his speech, the President sought to appoint officials who were in tune with and agreed with the policies set out in the speech and the ideas in the executive order. Officials who were willing to pay attention to what Congress said it wanted when it passed laws like the Clayton Act, the Anti-Merger Act, and other legislation. Lena Khan and Jonathan Kanter were great appointees and continue to be, and were committed to the President's goals as set out forth in the executive order. In addition, we felt that for too long, the administration had neglected the various competition mandates that Congress had created for agencies outside the DOJ, FTC, and the duties placed on agencies to try to promote competition in their industries. The fact is that Congress has, over the years, repeatedly directed the agencies outside of FTC and DOJ, including the Defense Department, Department of Transportation, Surface Transportation Board, many agencies, to try to stimulate competition and promote it in their areas. To coordinate and try to make real those mandates, the President created a competition council, White House Competition Council, which was chaired by the director of the National Economic Council, still chaired by the director, and comprised of the heads of 15 or so agencies. And they have, so far, been meeting with the President every 6 months, as stated in the executive order. The sense is, what have you been doing lately? And the sense is, if a congressional mandate is not coordinated, is not organized, it may sometimes just end up dying out. I feel, and again, I'm not a fully objective observer, feel that these institutional innovations have borne fruit. I want to suggest the leading example is the Department of Transportation and its Secretary, Pete Buttigieg. The Department of Transportation has not always been most vigorous in its duties to promote competition in the industry, despite the fact it has a mandate to do so from Congress. The DOT, for example, can enforce the Clayton Act, which I don't think everybody realizes, and it can also review mergers in the industry. I'm happy to say in March of this year that the Department of Transportation joined the Justice Department in challenging the JetBlue Sprint proposed merger. Secretary Buttigieg said in announcing this challenge, the Department of Transportation typically has not gotten involved in merger cases, but that is changing today. The DOT has also made major regulatory changes to how prices are displayed, prices being essential to the working of the competitive process, to include baggage and change fees, and done much to enforce airlines, really this is more consumer protection, to deal better with its cancellation than what it does for passengers. A few weeks ago, I want to say that Peter Buttigieg gave a barnbuster speech at the Anti-Monopoly Summit, and during that speech he concluded that despite everything they can do in consumer protection, that at its core, the structure of the industry needed to change. These are changes, I think, that are significant for the Department of Transportation and hopefully mark a new chapter in how it addresses its industry. Another representative example, I guess I should add also the DOJ happened to win the American Airlines JetBlue merger, which I also think was a victory in this area. Another representative example of what Competition Counsel and the White House approach has born or created is the opening of the hearing aid market, which was one of the goals of the executive order and kind of a showpiece for what we were trying to doing. It has long been my contention from reading and looking at the history of regulatory antitrust by rulemaking, that some of the biggest changes have come from undoing industry ties or unbundling goods and services. In the hearing aid market, we long had a tie between examinations by ear doctors and hearing aids that led both to very high prices and very weak competition. Now, after I rule, I was happy to read a headline in Asst the other day. This is the quote, "Hearing aids gain a hipper reputation as lifestyle products after going OTC." It's starting to happen that companies are entering the market given the opportunity to reach new customers. And one of the surprising things, actually something we didn't think would happen at all, is that people in their 30s and 40s, some of them are taking up hearing aids just because they want to hear better. And you can listen to music and stuff like that. A third and final example of the kind of thing we were trying to do with White House competition policy was the opening of the electric vehicle charging networks. We dedicated $8 billion to the build-out of electrical vehicle charging networks, but this was the input of antitrust people, contingent of those networks opening to all vehicles. And I'm very happy to say that on March 1st of this year, Tesla finally opened its charging network to other vehicles. It owns the nation's largest charging network. We called this electric net neutrality inside, and I think it has profound and important implications. There is plenty more to say about what we did through this effort of White House coordination of competition policy. I like to think that when we have free, pre-filled tax filing options for lower-income people, that is a part of the competition agenda, that forms part of the idea of lowering prices for people and increasing consumer welfare. The FTC has also sought, as you know, in this audience, to use its rulemaking powers, which has had and have been concerned by the D.C. Circuit to ban non-compete agreements, which was a presidential priority and a campaign promise. Finally, in the more traditional antitrust work, we've had merely a dozen abandoned mergers, including a large number of hospital mergers, something that the president was particularly focused on and which served as a priority for many of us over the years. The risk of going on too long, we have the merger guidelines coming soon, and those may end up being the most consequential thing the administration does over the longer term. So, as I said earlier, we took antitrust as part of economic policy, and we took from the spirit of FDR the idea that great matters of economic policy need to be subject to democratic processes. Now, as lawyers in law school, we associate this idea from the 1930s usually with the overruling of Lerner, and the idea and the acceptance of the idea that the elected officials, like the President and Congress, should have both the power and the responsibility to oversee and manage the economy. That concept isn't heavily contested today, There may be many precedents up for grab in today's Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court seems unlikely to overrule West Coast Hotel v. Parrish, or say things, well, you never know, but say that the Congress can't ban child labor. But the animating idea of Lochnerism, the idea that economic policy should be at a great distance from democratic input, that can become manifest in other ways, not necessarily in Supreme Court precedent. One much more subtle channel is through the insistence that all elected branches keep distance from certain areas of economic policies, such as the antitrust laws. This, I think, can, and in some cases in recent history did, lead to an antitrust doctrine that gets too far removed from the concerns of the population and broader economic goals. At its worst, a decade ago, critics called antitrust system a system captured by lawyers and economists, advancing their own self-referential goals, free of political control and economic accountability. Now we are those lawyers, so there's a little, might be some joy in having that self-referential goals, but I think that it's inconsistent with the democratic project. The President and Congress should not be walled off from antitrust policy, but that does still raise the question of what the President's role should be. There is one model, represented by Theodore Roosevelt, who first brought the laws to life by suing J.P. Morgan to block a railroad merger, that takes the antitrust law as a tool of popular sovereignty. Theodore Roosevelt said at the time, when aggregated wealth demands what is unfair, its immense power can be met only by the still greater power of the people as a whole. Theodore Roosevelt believed that the trust question could not be ignored in a democracy. He noticed that the failure of other democracies to respond to economic misery, economic concerns, could easily lead to revolution, much more extreme options, and a turn towards authoritarian leaders, in that era, communists and anarchists. That is, of course, something we've also seen in our time, both at home and overseas. That is, the rising popularity of authoritarian leaders who promise to do what democracies seem to be failing to do, that is, respond to the needs, the economic needs of the middle class and the vast majority of the people. That is why and one of the reasons has been a turn to authoritarian leaders who say they will take the side of the people against powerful companies, home or overseas. For these reasons, the first President Roosevelt reserved the final call on antitrust cases to himself, big antitrust cases. In his autobiography, he speaks of instructing his Attorney General to dissolve Standard Oil. The advantage of this approach was its clear lines of accountability. When Roosevelt sought the breakup of Standard Oil, a major decision, almost akin to declaring war, he told Americans that what he was doing as he was their elected leader. I should say that the idea that the President should be accountable for big decisions is, of course, taken for granted in other areas. We assume that the President steers trade policy. Tariffs obviously hurt and help various industries and customers, but no one really questions the President's role in trade. Another example is national defense. If someone asked President Biden how he felt about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it would have been slightly absurd for him to say, "I'm sorry, but the President does not comment on pending invasions, ongoing invasions, and that question is better directed to the Secretary of Defense." That said, there is a danger, obvious danger, in the direct involvement of the President in antitrust decisions. It can be ethically fraught. The President is not just an executive, but he's also a politician and a fundraiser. Theodore Roosevelt was accused of using the threat of antitrust as a tool for fundraising, and as many of you probably know, President Nixon, in the AT&T case, ordered his Deputy Attorney General to abandon a merger appeal, and suspiciously, it was close in time to a Maynard donation to the Republican National Convention. For these reasons, the Biden administration never sought to directly involve the President in individual case decisions making. Instead, again, we took FDR as presenting a better model. FDR appointed enforcement-oriented officials, self-styled at the time neo-Brandisians, who actually date from the 1930s. including figures like Robert Jackson, the future Attorney General and Supreme Court Justice, and Thurman Arnold, who was a Yale professor. FDR commissioned the study of the problem of economic concentration and also sought the passage of legislation, both in antitrust and other areas, particularly in other areas with the decentralized economy in mind. Some of these were ones in which Milton Handler played a major role. In fact, I reviewed some of Milton Handler's work for the temporary National Economic Commission in the late 1930s and 40s. And I found that his proposals for mergers, in fact, largely became the law in 1950 in the Anti-Merger Act. But he did go even further than I expected. I'll read you one of his proposals. He recommended a statutory presumption that would have made any acquisition or fusion presumptively unlawful when the acquiring company, after the acquisition, will control more than 15% of the market. So he favored a ban on mergers that would have led to more than 15% control, 15, not 50, of any market. Anyway, the lesson we take from this is that the Democratic branches should be engaged in antitrust policy. It is wrong to wall them off, and it should not just be the presidency, but it should be Congress as well. And Congress, not just in industry-specific ways, not just tinkering with immunities here and there, but engaged in responding to the judiciary, clarifying what it thought, and generally being in dialogue with courts and the presidency. Congress previously played this role in the Clayton Act and the Anti-Merger Act in 1950, but for far too long has confined itself to industry-specific deals and holding hearings. It is time for Congress to be engaged in a general and serious debate over general-purpose antitrust reform. Let me continue on that note, and in closing, note a few more things that remain to be done to institutionalize what I would suggest is our current era in antitrust, and to keep that ship turning. The judiciary is obviously a key part of the antitrust law's development, and unfortunately, in the race of priorities that is in every presidential administration, not enough attention has been paid to the economic views of the judges we have been appointing and their commitment to economic justice. In addition, in the manner that President Reagan appointed Judges Posner, Bork, Ginsburg, and Easterbrook to the bench, all distinguished law professors and experts in the antitrust, in the sense that President Clinton appointed Judge Diane Wood, the President, either in this term or in his next term, should appoint judges who have deep antitrust expertise to the bench and share his views on the antitrust laws. The White House Competition Council, which I mentioned earlier, also needs further institutionalization. I believe it should stay within the National Economic Council, but it should have an executive director, a few staffers, an economist, and an antitrust lawyer working for it. We actually had all of these when I was there, but it was an ad hoc arrangement, and it would be better institutionalized and continued from administration to administration. I want to leave you with the following ideas. First, in a democracy, that elected officials should have the power and duty to oversee and manage the economy. Second, that questions of economic structure and competition form a major part of economic performance. Third, the President, while not the only elected official, is the only official in the United States elected by a national constituency. If you accept these three premises, it follows that the presidency's engagement in antitrust law and competition policy is not only permissible, but appropriate and important if we are to maintain and remain a democracy. We do face in our times a rise in authoritarian leaders who are responding, as I said, to the failure of democracies to provide for their people. The antitrust law has long been a power and traditionally been a tool for rebalancing economic power and providing new opportunities to act on economic liberties. The new era of antitrust aims to return to those ideals and stand in a path that will continue to deliver on the American promise of opportunity and prosperity for all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. One of the most wonderful aspects of the handler tradition is its practice of bringing together folks from across the antitrust universe to engage. So as we reflect now on that keynote address, we transition to the interactive portion of the evening. And that gives me an opportunity to introduce our 4 very distinguished visiting experts and commentators. Starting on the left, Debbie Feinstein is the head of the antitrust group at Arnold and Porter, and from 2013 to 2017, she was the director of the FTC's Bureau of Competition. Sharon Robertson is a partner at Cohen Milstein, and she's a member of the firm's antitrust group and their executive committee. She's a nationally recognized leader in complex antitrust cases, and particularly in pharmaceutical matters. Ian Connor is a partner in the antitrust group at Latham and Watkins. From 2017 to 2021, he served in the FTC's Bureau of Competition, first as deputy director and then as director. Kellie Lerner is co-chair of the antitrust group at Kaplan. She represents individuals and businesses in high-stakes antitrust cases across the country. So I mentioned that one of the aspects of the great handler tradition is engagement from folks across the antitrust world, and that will be our format for the remainder of this evening's event. We're going to proceed as follows. Our panel has worked up a series of headline questions, partly based on what's going on in the antitrust world, and of course always subject to revision in light of their reflections on Professor Wu's remarks. So we're going to turn to each of our panelists in turn for a headline question. Then we're going to ask Tim to respond, and then we're going to have a little bit of follow-up, and then we'll move on to the next headline matter. So we're going to start. I'm going to try to keep one eye on the time, but we're here to engage, so don't hold back in jumping in. I hope there'll be some time at the end for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Let's see how we go. Let me start with Debbie.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that great talk, Professor Wu. You said that you thought that the new merger guidelines might be the most consequential thing that the agencies do. I guess the question is, how consequential will they be if the courts don't accept them? The agencies have had trouble winning the current cases in court, and do you think that the agencies can turn the courts around with these new guidelines, or is this only going to come about with congressional change of the antitrust laws?
That's a good question. You want me to respond right away, or? Yeah, sure. I think that a change, inside the White House, we often said that a lot of the stuff we do is one thing, but the big game hunt is merger policy, and the concentration of the economy is what has the largest long-term impact on people's lives. The merger guidelines are obviously a big part of that, and it's clear that the 2010 guidelines no longer reflect enforcement practice at the agencies. And so in that sense, they are no longer what they were supposed to be, which is a guide to the enforcement policies of the FTC and of the Justice Department. You asked whether courts will accept them or not. I think that they will, and I think the reason that they will is that the new guidelines will be based on both the statutory authority that is granted to the agencies and to the courts, and also that they will be backed by the precedent, which is actually underutilized in the 2010 guidelines. In other words, what I feel, and I've had no role in crafting these guidelines, I should feel, but I would say that the guidelines, held back from where precedent has been in Supreme Court. There hasn't been a case since, I guess, 1974 or so, but they are held back under use of the authority that the agencies have. And I have confidence that, courts at some level, ultimately, one hopes, obeys the law. I also feel that judges are not immune, as generalist judges, to the sense of where the tide of things are changing. And while we've lost antitrust cases, we've also won a lot of antitrust cases, we being the Biden administration. And, the judges, they're not spending all their time, criminal cases, civil cases, whatever, And if they have a good case, they'll rule with the administration, and then sometimes, some of the guidelines or these other principles that we hold on to so strongly matter less. When you look at the American Airlines JetBlue kind of pocket merger, for example, if you read that opinion, I mean, it's that they were caught essentially. If you look at the Random House, merger, they had the goods, and I think so long as the FTC and Justice bring good cases in front of generalist judges, they will win.
But they haven't been nearly as much as in past administrations. And you say that they'll accept new guidelines because they're based on precedent. Why is the precedent enough, not enough, to bring these cases over the finish line? It seems to me they're more about the facts than the law. So what accounts for the losses?
Well, I think this administration has taken a policy that they don't want to be chicken shit lawyers. They don't want to sit there and bring the cases they're only going to win. They have decidedly taken a position that we're willing to lose some cases and win some cases because we're in a long fight, and we want this to be a 10-year project of turning around the law. If that means we don't win every case, if that means we have a lower hit rate than other administrations, we're perfectly happy with that. I think we're going to win big cases. I think over time, with the precedent, with the statute, as we get back to legislative history, you will look back at this era and say this was the beginning.
I wonder if I might, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sharon.
No.
I wonder if I might pick up on something that you said. So if I understand you right, you sort of read the 2010 guidelines as falling back somewhat from, I take you to be talking about the Supreme Court cases of the 60s, setting out what we would regard now as pretty aggressive standards, strikingly aggressive standards for merger law. But I don't read that story so much as the agencies falling back. The federal courts have been pretty clear, right? The federal, not just district, but circuit courts across the country have been pretty clearly handling mergers in a way that is directly inconsistent with those cases in the 1960s. And in light of that reality, it's not obvious to me what the agencies could do except understand the state of the law, bring cases that reflects that understanding, and then issue guidelines that explain what the agencies are doing. Do you read the 2010 guidelines as doing something wrong in that regard?
Yes, I do. I think the 2010 guidelines, while an admirable intellectual project, I think, as I said, underuse the power granted to the agencies, both by the Supreme Court and Congress. And the last time I checked, the Supreme Court and Congress are superior to the courts of appeals. And I think that, and I didn't play a role in this, so I don't want to be taken as like the only defense on this. But I think the position is, and I'm not saying that the agencies should be suicidal. I think the agencies are winning and losing cases, and I think that's normal. But this is as I said, a long-term picture. They want to choose the cases carefully, but they don't want to be in a position where you look back at this and say, well, we're incredibly incremental in changing things. The president's direction to his enforcement officials, not in civic cases, but overall, is that we want to turn this ship. We want to do something different. We don't want you just to win safe cases, and that's the policy of this administration.
Let's go to Sharon.
Thank you, Professor Boo. That was a very engaging lecture. We appreciate it. So you spoke tonight, and you've written very extensively on the need to have an elected president involved in questions of economic structure and competition policy. And you've been very candid that your view is that a hands-on approach by a sitting president has proven throughout history to lead to more robust antitrust enforcement. But you've also been honest about the fact that there could be ethical issues that arise from a president being too involved in ongoing cases. And you talked tonight about the Roosevelt example of being accused of using the threat of antitrust action to solicit campaign donations. So what, at a practical level, strikes the right balance in terms of presidential involvement, right? I mean, you've now issued this executive order that's come out. If you're the next administration, what can you do to continue moving the ball forward? Because now you've instructed the agencies, here's ways that you can move the ball forward. What is there left to do? What would you do at a practical level?
No, I'm glad you asked that question. because it is a good and important question, ongoing question for the administration. So I'll make it clear. As I said before, I know that there are people who believe the president should be intimately involved in the big cases, the unilateral executive view of things. I found to my surprise that as late as after Nixon, as late as President Ford, they were still, and I don't know during the Clinton administration, but the presidents were still being briefed on some of the cases and apparently approving. I think Ford approved of the AT&T litigation. All this stuff is a little hard to research because it's all sort of oral history, but it's something I've become interested in. But the Biden administration did not take the view that even though we're suing companies that everybody knew and are important, like Google or Facebook or the airlines, we didn't take the view that the president should make the final call. In terms of what to do going forward, I think that's a very important question, and I think the president and the White House play a very important role when they coordinate and direct the agencies and directionally. Not to say sue this person, do this thing, but you have this authority. We want you to use it. We want you to work with other agencies. A good example, one the president was very fond of, was the junk fees initiative. Very obviously easy to talk about politically, but also quite economically sophisticated in terms of actually being about deceptive prices and the importance of pricing to the market mechanisms. And one of the things that was important about that effort is we realized a lot of agencies had some kind of power over deceptive prices. So instead of having every agency kind of running around doing one thing or another, who knows what, and some agencies doing nothing at all because they didn't feel like it, just say, look, let's all, nobody, who likes junk fees? Who likes showing up at a hotel and realizing there's a $60 charge when you check out you didn't know about? Like, nobody likes that stuff. But it's across a lot of industries and agencies, and so we can coordinate. I think the president of any administration should keep doing that, keep doing stuff that the public wants. One of the things I thought would be a good idea, we had 72 directives or suggestions for the agencies. I felt that we should amend the executive order going forward and keep adding to things as they came up. I wanted to add the electric charger stuff that we came up with. There's probably some stuff I shouldn't mention. Well, there was the tax filing ideas. Of course, it takes time and effort to amend executive orders, but I think an ongoing program of things that the president generally feels are part of the competition agenda outside of DOJ and FTC is an important project. And I think the White House also, maybe people in this room appreciate this, I think we need a good antitrust presence in the White House. There's a lot of stuff, antitrust expertise is, believe it or not completely intuitive. Some agencies might say, well, why would we let anyone else repair these devices that could be dangerous or something? The appreciation for the importance of competitive markets is not a universal human instinct, and it helps to have antitrust people in the White House to look over stuff like that.
Ian.
Professor Wu, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. So my question is focused on actually some of the rhetoric and discussions that you presented. It is common to see enforcement priorities change between administrations, including in antitrust. The rhetoric, however, following the arrival of the Biden administration has been unusually denigrating to prior enforcers. You yourself tonight noted some nuances about the fact that the increased enforcement had begun in the end of the Obama administration and it continued into the prior administration, but many of those nuances have not made it into more of the heated rhetoric that we have heard. For example, former Commissioner Chopra recently described the antitrust agencies as being in, quote, decay and disarray until his arrival along with his other commissioners in 2018. You yourself described some lawyers this evening as saying that the current enforcers are not chicken shit lawyers. And were quoted, at least by the Global Competition Review, as saying, unlike prior enforcers, this administration is not bringing chicken shit cases. And then went on to also be quoted by the Global Competition Review as saying that the age of green light merger is over, despite, as GCR pointed out in that article, that more mergers were abandoned and reported challenged in 2020 than in 2021. This criticism of past enforcement seems to ignore some of the innovations and efforts of prior administrations. For example, the patent settlement cases, the Orange Book sham listing cases. You mentioned in your talk the fact that a number of the hospital mergers were challenged by this administration, but that's actually built on a series of revamps that were done in the early 2000s into the 2010s that changed, I think, 6 consecutive hospital losses into a decade of repeated and unbroken wins in the hospital cases. And even on nascent competition, which has been a big push for this administration, there have been nascent competition cases litigated prior to Meta Within and that established a certain case law. This repeated refrain seems to possibly have been an explanation for the collapse in morale at the FTC, which has seen itself fall from the Bureau of Competition fell from the 3rd best place in the entire federal government to work to the high 400s. It did recover slightly this year up to, I think it's 380, but it's still pretty low in terms of good places to work. Can you discuss your views and what you think is the rationale from this administration in attacking or being so incredibly critical of prior enforcement efforts, especially given the innovations and the theories that have been put forward over the last 20 to 30 years by these public servants?
Thank you for that question, and I appreciate it. As you may know, I worked in FTC enforcement in the Obama administration, so it's a self-criticism in some ways. And I think that it's important to understand there's 2 goals and several goals going on here at once. And there is a strong desire to turn a corner, a strong desire to try, as I said earlier, to return closer to the statutory goals of the antitrust laws and to suggest the direction we were on was less than ideal. That is, for example, what motivates the sense that there was a green light era in merger enforcement, and in fact, I think I will stand by that comment. I worked during the FTC during that time. We passed on an extraordinary number of tech mergers. I think of the 1,000 big tech mergers in that period, the FTC and Justice came up with 1 consent decree. And, the sense that there was no potentially contentious mergers of the 1,000 mergers at a time, it just couldn't have been right. That is not to disparage the individuals who were working very hard. I was one of them. We were in a different time and place. We were working with a different set of assumptions. And I think, we really believed, not taking the role of a former, we really believed more strongly that the project we essentially started in the 90s of trying to improve on the Chicago schools' price theory would work. But I think we've lost faith in that and have sensed that it's more important intellectually to repudiate and move beyond it. Similar in some ways to what the Reagan administration did. Obviously, the Reagan administration made a clear point of turning from the previous efforts, even though obviously there was a lot of good people there, obviously a lot of good work was done, and obviously many feelings were hurt. But, we're not entirely here. We're talking about national politics. We're talking about stuff that matters. We're talking about economic structure. And I think, at a personal level, I regret the hurt feelings. I also feel that's part of politics. That's part of national policy. That's part of conversations we have to have. So I don't know if that is going to be satisfactory to you, but as perhaps the expression goes, you can't always make an omelet without breaking eggs.
Kellie.
So first, I just want to echo my co-panelists. Thank you so much for your remarks. They're incredibly insightful, and I personally applaud the ambition of the current administration's antitrust enforcement. My question is about the historic lows of leniency applications that started in previous administrations, but have...
Historic low of what, sorry?
Of leniency applications.
Okay.
Through the amnesty program.
Right.
This is something that's pretty well documented. And in the past, the Antitrust Division has pushed back pretty heavily on the idea of a whistleblower program for antitrust violations that includes any kind of financial reward. Given the current state of the amnesty program, is there any thought or consideration being given, or what are your views on the effectiveness of a whistleblower program in detecting cartel conduct that right now may be going undetected?
You know, it's a very good question. I hate to big out of this one, but I was so far from that work. And it almost was so inappropriate for the White House to be close to that kind of work because it's criminal leniency that I don't really have a formed view on it. I'm sorry to take that, but if you have another question.
May I ask another
question?
Sure.
Then.
Thank you. So going back to tech and what you and others have viewed as perhaps some lackluster enforcement in prior administrations, and going now to the present and even into the future, there has been healthy criticism that enforcers were somewhat reactionary to competition issues in the tech space. And we are at the dawn of a new frontier with generative AI. Do you have views on how we might get ahead of competition issues in that space, both from a private or public enforcement?
I do have views about that, and I'm glad you asked. I think the way we can get ahead of that issue in some ways is possibly not getting ahead of that issue. I am concerned that it's an opportunity to go on a different soapbox, but I've often felt that one of the greatest impediments to competition, or the greatest dampeners, the most effective exclusionary devices, is regulation. And I have a grave concern that the direction we're going on in AI regulation may help to insulate the most powerful tech platforms who own the most sophisticated technology from any meaningful competition, and help to manage to prevent the opening of the industry and the flourishing. Now, there are obviously potential dangers of AI that need to be taken seriously. Nobody wants to be overtaken by intelligent robots or anything along those lines, but there is also a danger based on abstract harms, unknown statements, offensive LLMs, not the law school LLMs, but the learning language models, being scary to people, of us going too far, creating a licensing system, creating something like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and insulating this industry from competition. So I'm very concerned about that area. I do think, I could go on along about this, I do think there's areas that do need regulation. I think the ability of AIs to pass as human is dangerous, and that AI should be forced to proactively identify themselves as non-human. I like the movie Blade Runner, but I think it's also becoming a serious problem of the corruption of reputational systems. But anyway, I'll go on. There's stuff, but I am very concerned we're going to set up a licensing system or something like that that will dampen competition, hurt innovation, and deliver the future. And we'll look back and say, they talked tough on tech, but they ended up insulating the biggest tech platforms from any meaningful competition.
Yeah. I asked ChatGPT what you would say in response to that question. It gave me like 90% of your answer. Just kidding.
Well, it's the extra.
That's amazing. Before we go back to, that's really hard to follow. Before we go back to Debbie, I want to follow up on something that you said
Sure.
when you were replying to Ian. Partly because I share the concerns that Ian articulated, and partly because I've spent some time thinking about that period where, as you say, there were transactions in the tech space, and there wasn't antitrust litigation generally in connection with those deals. And my question is, do you think any of those were easy cases? So I have one in my mind. I look back at Google AdMob, where the theory was, Apple's coming in, and then Apple didn't come in. And that, I can see how in retrospect that looks, more clear than perhaps some others. But my impression is that I sort of hear all the time, there were loads of really bad-looking tech deals that no one did anything about. And I spent a lot of time working on the Facebook case, and I deeply believe in the FTC's complaint challenging the WhatsApp and Instagram acquisitions. But those are non-trivial cases, right? They're complicated in some important ways, and they're path-breaking in some important ways. And it's not obvious to me that there's a long line of other tech transactions, even among the many that, as you say, that took place. I don't know that it was 1,000 that clearly raised competitive issues, but I don't know that there's a long list where even in the rearview mirror, I would say, gosh, that was a sitting duck of an antitrust case that the agencies inexplicably failed to challenge. Even if you set aside the resource constraint issue, which means that every case you investigate and litigate is another case you're not investigating and litigating, and it's not always easy to say no to a 3-to-2 hospital merger to take a long shot on an innovative Section 2 case. So as you look back at that period in tech enforcement, obviously it's 1,000 miles away from the climate we're in today. Do you think any number of those cases were easy, or do you see them as hard cases where it was worth taking the resource hit and pushing the button anyway?
It's a good question, and it is a further chance to reflect on this hurt feelings question, which has been challenging for me. As I said, I worked during that era. I know most of the people. Some of the people are newer. They don't know anybody. I have, the deepest respect for everyone who was at the FTC during that era, and I don't think anyone was like sitting around drinking beers all day and not doing their job. I think actually there was extraordinary amount of work, sense of public duty, some real important successes, pay for delay cases being an example, in the environment you were in. And part of this is politics. It's about, part of politics is if you agree with everything came before, it's very difficult to politically move the next level. And I think it needs to be understood as that. I'm not going to stand back from anything we've said because I don't feel that is the way you do it, but it is important to understand what's going on here. That doesn't mean I actually think the people during that time weren't doing their job. When you look back at that era, I think the question is, were the cases hard given the environment and thinking in the 2010 merger guidelines and so forth, or should the questions have been hard in light of the goals of the 1950 Anti-Merger Act, Section 7 of Clayton, the kind of environment Milton Handler was in when he was writing this. I think if you brought Milton Handler and he looked at cases like Google Waze, where you effectively had 2 mapping programs and they were becoming one. Now somehow that avoided I don't exactly, that never came up somehow got by the FTC and the Justice Department. It could have gone back and got it. I think Milton Handler would have said, you got to be kidding me. This is a merger to monopoly. I think Instagram and, judged from, let's say, a person in 1951, I think a lot of those are easy cases. And look like mergers to monopoly or near monopoly or obvious efforts to buy a competitor. Instagram, which you have a close acquaintance with, looks very much, and what's up on Instagram looks very much like a rising challenger being bought off as a potential threat. And you obviously have the emails from the founder of the firm indicating an intent to suppress competition. So no, I don't think those were so hard from the perspective of 1951. And I think that's an important perspective.
Let's go to Debbie.
I have to make a comment first, and then I'll ask a question. The comment is that don't think that when you hear from the enforcers that the previous enforcers that they're frustrated about the comments, that it's about hurt feelings. It's about a fear that in past administrations there's from one administration to the next. A good example of that, I have two examples of that. One is the reverse patent settlement cases, which were losses, but people kept trying and trying, and they built on it. They didn't criticize the losses. They said, what can we learn from them? Let's take the baton. Let's do some empirical studies. Let's show that when the number of generics come in. And so there was this sense of, I'm going to take what has been done before me and build on it, rather than suggest that everything that has been done has been bad. Another example is hospital mergers. As was mentioned, by the time I got to the FTC, hospital mergers were still really hard. We lost 2 of them in the district court, but we got appeal court wins. And we did that through the baton pass from one administration to the next to the next. And I'm concerned, I think the My question is going to be in something different, but I'm taking a point of privilege to make this point because I've been thinking about it a lot, is that there's a fear that by not recognizing the important things that the agencies did do during the Obama administration, they can't build on them. To give an example of the great innovation of the 2010 guidelines was unilateral effects, which led to a number of important wins, Cisco, Staples, a number of cases like that. The notion that there wasn't anything done on nascent competition and that it was invented in this administration, we got $100 million in a nascent competition case. We brought the Steris case. So I think, that ought to be the lens through which people hear this criticism of the criticism. It's not that our feelings are hurt. It's that we are concerned that the agencies aren't bringing forth and learning from what we did well and what we didn't do as well to take it forward, rather than suggesting we just need to throw out everything they did because they didn't know what they were doing. They had a pro-monopoly bent, and so they were just bad enforcers. Okay, you're welcome to comment on that if you'd like. My question was going to be on something completely different, which is that in an interview at the Anti-Monopoly Summit, you discussed residual powers that the administration should use to reduce prescription drug prices, and we were just curious what you had in mind by that.
Okay, sure. Let me comment on the comment first and then answer the question. So first of all, so the baton passing is a good question, and I think, it is happening behind the scenes. How do we winning these hospital merger cases? Well, obviously the ground was set by the FTC over the many years prior to these administrations. And I, don't think, I can't speak for everyone in the administration, obviously, but why would we repudiate or say nothing was done in nascent competition when Microsoft is obviously the foundation of a lot of that thinking? And in my own writing, we center everything on the Microsoft case. We don't agree with everything that approach taken in the Microsoft case. I think it's maybe too easy on tying, but the idea that we would abandon Microsoft's most important merger in tech cases is not something we would do. That said, these things are happening at different levels. The Reagan administration, we haven't talked about the Reagan administration very often. That's another administration that wanted to turn the ship. That's another administration that felt they had a democratic justification for doing so. And, this is kind of counter to interest, the direction I want to go, but I have to say that administration is very effective. And if you think we're repudiating people, look at them. I mean, what I'm trying to say is the Reagan administration made very clear that they were turning, repudiating, and changing, and not going to follow the ways the previous administrations had done. And I'm sure they lost some batons, many batons in the process, but over a scope of 12 years, had decisively changed the operation of the antitrust laws. And I think that is more the path we are taking. That is to say, we are, as I've said many times, seeking a more fundamental level of change, and it comes with costs and it comes with benefits. As for pharmaceutical drugs, one of the things I've felt, obviously it's a difficult issue to work on because it's very frustrating to have an industry which has so effectively managed to harness certain powers of government, particularly the patent system, to protect and extend its powers in ways that we felt were contrary to the public interest. But there were residual powers in the Affordable Care Act given to try to design models that might more aggressively affect the price of pharmaceutical drugs, particularly spending on Medicaid and Medicare. Sorry, not Medicaid, Medicare. And we had felt, and I don't think it's over, that the administration could be more aggressive in how it designs its models and how it pays for Medicare. There's another long battle. There's I don't know if I want to say too much more about that topic, given it's still ongoing, but I had felt that there were, in the Affordable Care Act, reserves of power that had not been used, and that we should use them. And the fate of that effort is ongoing.
Thanks.
Sharon.
So, Professor Wu, you've been open about the challenges that you faced during your time at the White House in terms of implementing certain policy objectives, particularly when it comes to passing laws that you feel a supermajority of Americans support, such as the institution of child privacy laws. And it's also no secret that the government, and in particular the agencies at the executive order tasked with carrying out the whole of government policy initiative, lack the resources, right, to go after all of the types of anti-competitive conduct that they see or anti-competitive concerns that they have. Given these challenges, have you thought about how the private bar can partner with government or perhaps work on their own to help advance the initiatives that are set forth in the executive order?
I haven't given the idea a great deal of thought, although I welcome it and would like to think more about it. I felt that we tried to engage more with state officials, and that was something. We had the AGs come to visit us a few times and support their efforts. But in terms of the private bar, that wasn't. I think that's sort of untapped potential. I agree with you. I did find it very frustrating that, with great frequency, Congress did not do things that huge 95% of American people probably think should happen. Good examples: who feels that child privacy is adequately protected online? I would guess 0% of Americans believe that. There was a bill. There was also content protection. There were bills to protect this, increase the protection of children's privacy online, and all of them died sad deaths by people who have very carefully hidden their tracks as to who killed them, but buried in stupid fights about nothing. And, it is a real, everyone says this, but it's a real crisis, the fact that Congress is not responsive to the American public. That is the main, it is not actually the fact the president should be doing all this stuff. A lot of this should be done by Congress. And their desire to waste times on stupid things and get into fights and not do what people want to do is really reached a crisis point. And I think it understates why we're at such this, in so many areas of the republic, people feel frustrated. It's because the core part of the government, which is supposed to be representative to the people, is not working.
So we have 10 minutes left on the clock. We have Ian and Kellie, and I hope we might get time for one, maybe even two questions from the floor if we're all reasonably brisk. Let's go to Ian.
Okay. So first, I will note that I did not have "We're like the Reagan administration" on my bingo card for the evening, for the Biden administration. So, but my question is, so Covington put out a study recently looking at the level of merger enforcement by the Biden administration in terms of percentages and in terms of cases, and found that there had been a drop-off in the number of cases, both on a percentage and on an actual numbers level, over the first 2 years of the Biden administration versus both the first 2 years of the Trump administration, and especially in the last year of the Trump administration. And then in the HSR report that came out from the agency, it showed that while there was a slight uptick in total number of second requests, I think it went from 64 to 66 or 62 to 64, as a percentage of HSR filings, second requests actually plummeted quite a bit from the year-over-year averages previously. Can you talk about what you think the drivers are for the nominal drops in merger enforcement between the two administrations?
No, thanks. That's a good question. I said at the beginning that it's a good question. I also want to reemphasize that it would be a mistake to understand the work of this administration with a narrow focus on a few prominent or even the stats around merger enforcement, which is part of, admittedly, a large part of antitrust, but something we were trying to avoid being all of antitrust. We do, and as I said earlier, the big game hunt is merger policy. But I don't want that to be understood as the entirety of our administration's work or my previous employer's work. I think that in an ideal, probably non-existent universe of merger policy, there would be no second requests because no one would try to bring forth or get across a merger that was illegal. And I do believe that one thing we've seen, and one of the successes of this administration, lies in the dogs that are not barking. That is, the mergers that people are not wanting to bring because they know they're not going to get them across the line, or they're going to face a complicated challenge. Now, how do you measure that? I don't have an easy way of doing it. You have anecdotal reporting, you have talking to people, you have the fact that the kind of mergers that happened in the 2010s, which logically might have been tried now, maybe Facebook trying to acquire TikTok or Snap as a strategic move, seem completely off the table. But I think the measurement of our success and what I think we want to see happen should be measured in terms of deterrence as opposed to second requests.
My only, I guess the one question on that is, so 2022 saw, I think it was 3,500 filings. It was a 100% increase over the year before. You would have at least expected to see some increase in second requests, even if there was a deterrent effect, but that did not materialize.
I'm entirely sure I follow it, and I guess
Well, I guess, so
Yeah.
I'll explain. So the number of merger filings went up about 100% year over year, but you did not see even a 50% or 10% increase in the number of second requests.
I think that as I said before, I don't think that the track record of the administration will turn on the question of things like second requests and those sorts of statistics. I think the questions are going to be whether we have turned the boat, whether people think differently about what kind of mergers you want to bring, whether we start to win more high-profile cases, and whether we manage to activate the other agencies in the administration to complete their competition mandates, and overall return the antitrust laws closer to what we believe that Congress intended.
Kellie.
That actually dovetails really well with the question that I had for you, which is that in the past and tonight in your remarks, you said the goal of this administration was to turn the ship around. And my question is, given the many successes in the current administration when it comes to antitrust enforcement, if the goal was 180 degrees, how far do you think you've succeeded in pushing it around? And what do you think is left to do to make it that full 180 turn? With the caveat that you did mention in your remarks, and I appreciated some additional thought into judicial nominations, which makes good sense. But if you have other views on what it will take to get there, I'd love to hear it.
It's a good question. I don't think we're looking for 180 degrees. That would be going the exact opposite direction. I don't think that maybe the only person who did that was President Roosevelt, who went from zero, no enforcement at all of the antitrust laws, or maybe a little bit against labor unions, to bringing cases against mergers to monopoly. I think there is work to do. I think we're maybe 15-20% of the way along. Some of the things that I'd like to see happen, some of the biggest challenges lie ahead, are in, speaking now from the non-DOJ and FTC side of it, trying to get the health and human services and healthcare and drug and the entire area of healthcare more oriented towards competition is a major challenge that I'm not sure we've gotten where we need to be. That is obviously an important sector of the economy. I think the FTC has done particularly important work in this area, but the core of it remains a large number of markets are anti-competitive, are mixed in with government regulation and all kinds of challenges. And I feel like that is I don't know if that's a final frontier, but certainly an area that needs a lot more work and will probably always need a lot more work. I already mentioned the judiciary. I'm not trying to say every member of the judiciary needs to swear up and down that they will enforce the Section 7 of the Clayton Act as it was intended in 1950. But I do believe that we have a kind of inattention to the economic and antitrust views of the judiciary, and one that is out of line with what the administration has been seeking in terms of its broader structural goals in policy. There's a lot of the FCC, I could go on a long time with this. The FCC has been stuck at a non-democratic majority for a long time. I think we announced an appointment. There's an enormous amount of work to be done in spectrum and related areas that has just been on hold for 2 years. We're supposed to restore net neutrality, among other things. We haven't done that. So anyway, there's a risk of this becoming a huge list of things. As everyone in this room knows, the pursuit of promotion of competition in the American economy is a never-ending journey, a never-ending voyage, and there's, as the Microsoft majority said, always new ways of thinking of exclusionary behavior. And some of it comes from government, and that's a task that we need to be taking on.
So we have 2 minutes left on the clock, and I can't think of a better use than to take a terse, crisp question from the audience. So, Sarah.
Good evening, Professor Wu. Thanks for taking the question. I'm curious, I wanted to ask you about...
Seems weird not to be able to see.
I wanted to ask you about a letter that was sent by Antitrust Division staff to the Securities and Exchange Commission about a proposed rule that the SEC has on order flow execution disclosures for broker-dealers. And in their comment letter, they encourage the Securities and Exchange Commission to consider the competitive effects of the proposed rule in implementing its rule. I'm curious to hear, that's a good example of the agencies having a dialogue about proposed rulemaking and sort of the competitive effects of proposed rulemaking.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear, did you see enough of that when you were in the administration, or do you think there needs to be more done for agencies to have dialogue about the competitive effects of proposed rules?
I appreciate you bringing that up. I would say both. In other words, we saw and began to see more of it, but we still wanted more and more. And it was inconsistent as to what agencies, were receptive and not. SEC is an example of an agency that was generally good about these things, CFPB and others. Other agencies who I don't necessarily feel like naming, but might regulate healthcare, were less receptive to the importance of competition in their spaces, as an example. And so it was mixed. But I think that was the goal of this, of the Competition Council in particular, was to bring these agencies together, sometimes to have them work. The DOJ is a great partner in this, and has always wanted to be a good partner in this, and have them kind of work on things and say, have you thought about that rule and what kind of market power it's going to create? Like, maybe they should think twice about that. And hey, you got this merger going on. Do you want some help? Should we do this together? That kind of stuff. I think, most of us are focused in this room on the DOJ and the FTC. All of us here worked there, but the world is bigger than those two agencies, and this was a major thing. In closing, I want to say great thanks. The theme of this, I know Henry in the democratic deficit in antitrust was identified as a problem 10 years ago. One way or another, I think we can disagree on what we should do, but I don't think we entirely should disagree that the democratic process is important, that we need revitalization of antitrust, we need these debates, and we need to go forward for seeing what we all want to do, which is to promote economic growth, sustained prosperity, and the future of the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Wu, to our distinguished panel, Yiwa, David, Craig, and the others who brought us together. Thank you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to joining you for drinks.